graphically detailing the events as they happened. Author William Peter Blatty became privy to the notes. He changed the main character from a boy to a girl, wrote a novel called The Exorcist, and the rest is history. The Exorcist was a huge commercial success, becoming one of the most popular movies of all time, with people waiting in long lines just to see the film based on word of mouth. After seeing the movie, some viewers became dizzy, vomited, developed insomnia, and even had miscarriages. A new term, cinematic neurosis, was coined to describe the phenomena. The film also created a satanic panic that is responsible for the death of at least one mentally ill girl whose parents were convinced she was demonically possessed. The Town That Dreaded Sundown, 1976. In the spring of 1946, a masked killer stalked, murdered, and terrorized people in the Twin Cities of Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas. Within a 10-week time span, the killer assaulted 8 people, murdering 5 of them. Like the Zodiac Killer, most of the murders took place near lovers' lanes. The media referred to these killings as the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, and Charles B. Pierce's The Town That Dreaded Sundown retells the story on the screen. 2 people who survived the attacks by the Phantom could only describe him as about 6 feet tall and wearing a pillowcase with the eye holes cut out. The name of the movie refers to the hysteria the area went into with so many murders in such a short amount of time. Police investigated over 400 suspects, but the identity of the Phantom Killer remains unknown. The Town That Dreaded Sundown is heavily fictionalized. For example, the infamous trombone scene was scripted for morbid entertainment value. There is no evidence that the Phantom Killer killed anyone this way. The closest link to reality is that one of the victims was playing a saxophone in a band the night she was killed. The movie also has a series of strange moments of comic relief. A remake of the film was made in 2014, and the 1976 version is screened in Texarkana every year on Halloween. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. It's impossible to call this classic film real. It's a work of fiction, more or less, through and through. That said, some inspiration for the character of Leatherface comes from a real-life murder body snatcher, Ed Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield or the Plainfield Ghoul. The film's main killer, Leatherface, was fictional, but in real life, Ed Gein made masks and other wares out of human bodies. Director Tobe Hooper also says his film was inspired by Texas killers Elmer Wayne Henley and Dean Corll, who lured and slaughtered boys near Houston in the early 1970s. Hooper's writing partner Kim Henkel said he saw a news interview with Elmer Wayne that laid the foundation for Texas Chainsaw's cannibal family. He had this conventional morality at that point. He wanted it known that now that he was caught, he would do the right thing. So this kind of moral schizophrenia is something I tried to build into the characters. The Amityville Horror, 1979. The truest horror story that happened in the home at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, is that on November 13th, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed his parents and brothers and sisters, annihilating his entire family while they slept. DeFeo confessed to the murders, but pled insanity during his trial. An insanity plea involves not whether the defendant experiences mental health issues, but whether they were at the time of the crime unaware that the crime was wrong. As part of DeFeo's confession involved telling police how he discarded evidence, he was clearly aware that what he had done was wrong. He was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and died in prison in March 2021. 1 year after the DeFeo murders, George and Kathy Lutz bought the house and moved in with their 3 children. The Lutz family fled the Amityville home in the middle of the night 28 days later, after experiencing an increasingly malevolent haunting. The family claims they saw glowing red eyes, experienced sudden levitation, and saw objects fly around the room. George Lutz said he kept waking up at 3:15 a.m., the time the DeFeo murders happened. The Lutz family story was immortalized in the best-selling Jay Anson book, The Amityville Horror, and subsequently made into the 1979 film starring James Brolin and Margot Kidder. There are now over 30 films based on the Amityville haunting, and the story is likely responsible for one of the highest-grossing horror franchises of all time, The Conjuring, which follows paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. Many people have come forward to debunk the Amityville haunting, including the priest the Lutz family say blessed the home, and the subsequent owners who could not verify the damage described in the book. In 1979, the lawyer who represented Ronald DeFeo Jr. in his murder trial, William Weber, told people, "I know this book is a hoax. We created this horror story over many bottles of wine." After decades of silence, Daniel Lutz, who was in his teens when the family lived there, came forth with a documentary called My Amityville Horror, 2013, and insisted it all happened. "I was possessed by a spirit I couldn't get rid of on my own. I just wanted somebody to believe me. It has been in my dreams my whole life." The Entity, 1982. This movie is inspired by the 1974 case of Doris Bither, a mother of 4, who alleged that the ghosts of 3 men were sexually assaulting her. Bither was studied by doctoral students in parapsychology at University of California, Los Angeles, and the case became known as the Entity haunting. It's probably not a coincidence that this event took place at the height of The Exorcist's popularity. The movie takes many liberties and is a generally well-received horror thriller movie from the 1980s. On closer inspection, despite the sexual violence, it is also a rather feminist tale with an incredibly powerful female lead, played by Barbara Hershey. Poltergeist, 1982. Steven Spielberg created the story used for Poltergeist, and Tobe Hooper created the collaboration. Spielberg says he conceived the idea as a sequel to his film Close Encounters of the Third Kind from 1977. This time, rather than danger coming from the skies, the idyllic suburban family home was the source of terror. This cult classic is based on the real story of James Herman and Lucille Herman of Long Island, New York in 1958. The Herman family reported real poltergeist activity when they moved into a new home, such as bottle caps popping off the bottles at random, bookshelves falling over for no reason. Inviting a priest to bless the house only made matters worse. When Lucille asked if she had watched the Poltergeist movie, she had a chilling response. "I never saw Poltergeist. I had my own nightmare." It's one thing to watch a scary movie. It's an entirely different thing when your actual life is one. In a case of real life imitating art, imitating real life, some people consider Poltergeist to be a cursed movie. Heather O'Rourke, who played Carol Ann, died at age 12 from complications of a bowel obstruction. Dominique Dunn, who played Dana, died at age 22 when her ex-boyfriend strangled her to death. Her ex, John Sweeney, served only 3 years and 7 months for her murder. Part of the Poltergeist curse may be due to Steven Spielberg's insistence on using real human skeletons during filming. A Killer in the Family, 1983. This made-for-television movie is based on a true story where a father convinces his 3 sons to help break him and his cellmate out of prison. They do. Incredibly, at the time, inmates' families were allowed picnics with them. The sons brought a cooler filled with sawed-off shotguns and revolvers. After escaping, things spiraled completely out of control, and the prison break story turns into even more crime, including a killing spree. The real name of the father that started all of this is Gary Tyson, and the local Arizona newspaper has an in-depth explanation of his real life and crimes. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. For casual horror films, it might come as a surprise that this 80s horror thriller from Wes Craven was inspired by an actual event and particularly disturbing moment in world history in Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War. After the end of the Cambodian Civil War in the 1970s, the Communist Party took control of the country and killed over 1 million people. This Cambodian genocide where this was done are called the Killing Fields, and Craven was inspired by a family that escaped them to the United States, but one of their children ended up still having horrible dreams about being murdered. Wes Craven explains in his own words in a 1999 interview, "The history of A Nightmare on Elm Street is kind of interesting. I read a newspaper article in the LA Times about an immigrant, a recent immigrant to the United States. A young man who had complained to his parents about severe nightmares. I think they were from Cambodia, and he was assured that the nightmares were not that unusual. He shouldn't be so afraid. He started staying up and refusing to sleep. The family became very concerned, and they sought the help of a doctor. The doctor prescribed sleeping pills. The young man apparently took them, and in the end, it turned out he did not. He was taking them and putting them aside. He had a coffee pot in his room after a while to stay awake, and nobody knew what to do. At one point, he was downstairs watching television in the middle of the night, and he fell asleep. His family noticed, finally, that he was asleep, and they brought him up to his bed. The whole family went to bed themselves thinking, thank God, finally he's asleep. Then they heard screams an hour later, ran into his room. He is thrashing in his bed. By the time they got to him, he was dead." What makes this very true story even creepier and unbearably morbid is that many of the young men that fled Cambodia during the genocide also experienced the same psychological terror, which was later classified as sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. This is likely the newspaper clipping that Craven read in the early 80s. Child's Play, 1988. Remember that evil but also kind of comical killer doll, Chucky? That little guy was inspired by a real-life voodoo doll, Robert the Doll. In the 1900s, a young boy, Eugene Robert Otto, was given a doll. Just like Chucky, the doll ended up terrorizing the child and other children that would inherit it. Now it's in a museum and advertised as a doll suffering from demonic possession. The staff where the doll is held in Key West report strange things around it, like Robert's facial expressions changing. hearing demonic giggling, and some have even seen Robert put his hand up to the glass. Robert the doll does not really look like Chucky, but this is the doll where the whole horror franchise started. Dead Ringers, 1988. This creepy Cronenberg film is based on two real people, Stuart and Cyril Marcus, identical twin gynecologists who practiced together in New York City. In Cronenberg's version of the story, the twins share women, trade places during surgery, and exhibit other creepy behavior. Think of this movie as American Psycho meets the television show Nip Tuck, but with twins. Cronenberg's version is fictionalized. However, the strange ending where the twins isolate more and more from society and die through what seems to be a drug overdose or barbiturate withdrawal is based on reality. That said, the twins in real life were bizarre people, and some who knew them say the truth about these twins might be stranger than Cronenberg's fiction. Here is how one woman describes her experience with the twins in real life. In the summer of 1975, a pair of 45-year-old twins, their bodies gaunt and already partially decomposed, were found dead at a fashionable Manhattan address in an apartment littered with decaying chicken parts, rotten fruit, and empty pill bottles. The bodies were those of Cyril and Stuart Marcus, doctors who had apparently died more or less simultaneously as the result of a suicide pact. Like many people, I was shocked by this information. Two things contributed to that. One, the men's twinship, the doubleness that had given them a mutual birth date, and now a mutual death date as well. Another was the men's prominence. They had been among New York's most well-known obstetrician gynecologists. You can read the rest of their story at the lineup and the original New York Times article about their death. Silence of the Lambs, 1991. The film's primary villain, James Buffalo Bill Gum, was inspired by not only Ed Gein, but also Philadelphia serial killer Gary Heidnik, who lured people into his van, brought them home to murder them, and kept their body parts in his refrigerator. It was also loosely based on Ted Bundy. Buffalo Bill made clothes out of human skin, just like Gein, kept sex slaves in his basement like Heidnik, and lured them using fake plaster casts, just like Ted Bundy. Fire in the Sky, 1993. This is based on, not inspired by, a story in Arizona from the mid-1970s. That sounds unbelievable, but was corroborated by several sources. You can find all the details in a book by Travis Walton that explains his encounter with a UFO in 1975. He and about half dozen other members of a road crew were dazzled by a yellow light in the sky that upon further examination was a UFO. When the subject struck Travis with a light beam and appeared to kill him, the other members fled. Instead of being killed, though, Travis was discovered 5 days later, naked, shaking, and a dozen pounds lighter. He claims to have been taken aboard the spaceship. Disturbingly, all the other members of the road crew, who were initially suspected of murdering Travis and concocting the story to save themselves, all passed polygraph tests. Scream, 1996. Scream isn't based on a pair of high school killers tormenting their classmates, but it is based on a true story. In August 1990, the city of Gainesville, Florida went into a hysteria as a serial killer committed a series of especially gruesome murders over the course of 4 days. The Gainesville Ripper was eventually caught and revealed to be a man named Danny Rawling, who also murdered a family in Shreveport, Louisiana. In 1995, writer and struggling actor Kevin Williamson was house-sitting in Los Angeles when he caught an episode of the tabloid news show Turning Point, and it was about the Ripper. Alone in an unfamiliar home, Williamson tried to distract himself by calling a friend. Their conversation turned to horror and which scary movies they liked. Williamson hung up the phone and wrote 18 pages about a woman talking on the phone with the killer about scary movies. That became the opening scene of Scream. The Mothman Prophecies, 2002. Marketing for The Mothman Prophecies heavily emphasized that the film was based on true events. How real was it, though? Particularly given this is a movie about a mysterious creature that makes phone calls and can predict the future? Well, there really is an urban legend about a being called the Mothman that is told in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. However, no actual evidence proves that this paranormal entity exists. According to folklore, the Mothman is a humanoid creature with glowing red eyes and a 10-foot wingspan. It was first seen in Point Pleasant on November 15, 1966, after a local bridge collapsed on December 15, 1967, killing 46 people. The Mothman sightings ceased. In 1975, John Keel popularized the Mothman to the rest of the world in his book, The Mothman Prophecies. This book is the basis for the 2002 film. Open Water, 2003. Shark movies are a dime a dozen, but Open Water is a unique shark attack movie because it is based on a real story and two real people, Thomas Joseph Longerman and Eileen Cassidy Longerman. The married couple were on a scuba diving excursion in Australia. The tour company made a mistake, though, and left without them, leaving the couple to fend for themselves in the open water. But it very well could have been a shark attack, which is how the horror film sees it. Speaking of real things, all the sharks used in Open Water were real, and the actors interacted with real sharks in all the scenes. As National Geographic noted, while we have a shark fear frenzy in the media, there really aren't that many actual shark events. There is a sequel, Open Water 2, Adrift, that claims to be inspired by real events, but it's not. It was based off the short story Adrift by Japanese author Koji Suzuki. The Exorcism of Emily Rose, 2005. This story of an exorcism is inspired by real events that happened to Anneliese Michel, a young German woman who died of dehydration and malnutrition after a period of about 10 months, during which 67 exorcisms were performed on her. Tragically, it is most likely Anneliese Michel was only experiencing mental health issues, but the widespread popularity of the movie The Exorcist convinced her family that the problem was demonic possession. Anneliese was born in Germany in 1952 into a devoutly Catholic household. She was diagnosed with depression and epileptic psychosis at age 16 in 1968 and was unsuccessfully treated in psychiatric institutions. By 1972, she was suicidal. The next year, The Exorcist came out. Anneliese experienced seizures and hallucinations. She growled and had violent reactions to religious objects. Then she started seeing devil faces and hearing voices telling her she'd rot in hell. She'd claimed to be possessed by Lucifer, Cain, Judas, Nero, and Hitler. In 1975, 2 priests started performing exorcisms on Anneliese. These horrifying sessions were recorded, and you can still listen to the audio of them. Finally, after 67 exorcisms, she died of dehydration and malnutrition in 1976 at the age of 24. The Girl Next Door, 2007. This movie depicts an atrocious true story of child abuse and murder. Here is the real backstory explained. The murder of Sylvia Likens was a child murder which occurred in Indianapolis, Indiana, in October of 1965. Likens was 16. She was held captive and subjected to increasing levels of child abuse and torture, committed over a period of almost 3 months by her caregiver, Gertrude Banaszewski. Many of Banaszewski's children and several other neighborhood children before ultimately succumbing to her injuries on October 26th. The torture and murder of Sylvia Likens is widely regarded by Indiana citizens as the worst crime ever committed in their state and has been described by a senior investigator in the Indianapolis Police Department as the most sadistic case he had ever investigated in the 35 years he served with the Indianapolis Police. The movie itself is somewhat of an accurate portrayal of what happened and is very difficult to watch, though of course it is highly dramatized. For more information on what happened here, after you watch the movie, consider reading John Dean's nonfiction book, House of Evil, The Indiana Torture Slaying, which goes into more detail about this case of true crime.